Hello and welcome to my latest video. So this video is a little bit of an interesting one. It is the latest video in the series for how to paint Lady Annika, and in this particular video I'm going to be painting her, I guess like the inner dress section you'd call it, or the skirt. But so the issue is that I spent quite a long time painting the whole thing, and you're going to see that in this video, and then at the very end of it I hated it, so I end up completely blacking it all out, and I have a completely different plan now for what I'm going to do there. But the problem was that it had taken a long time to paint, and I'd already filmed it all, so I didn't have anything to show you after I'd blacked it all out. So I thought I'd show you anyway what I've done, and because it's not really terrible or anything like that. I just decided that it wasn't good enough for what I wanted. And I'll explain a little bit about what happened and why I didn't like it as the video goes along. So just to start off with, I wanted to get a base down, and this is just to get the highlight points on, because the idea is I'm going to paint a pattern on top of the dress, and it's going to be kind of like a little bit gothic, sort of twisty vines and things. And you know, if you do that, if you just paint it straight onto a flat surface, well, it's a lot easier if you do that. So you can have, you know, very clean lines, because you can just use the black to rub everything out and cut into it and make everything super clean and sharp. The problem occurs though when you don't have any light source on that, because you can either paint over the top of it, which becomes very, very tricky because you have to paint around all the details so they don't vanish, or you can glaze over them. And then they'll just fade into the background, which is not necessarily wrong, and I do a little bit of that towards the end of this video, because you know, light can, or very often does, wash over the top of details on top of fabrics or any material really, so it can hide a lot of that detail, and same for shadows as well. You know, the details can get lost in the shadows. So it's not necessarily wrong to cover over the top of it, but it does often feel a lot like you're painting details on and then you're wiping them out again afterwards. So it can be a little bit disheartening, especially, you know, because you hide a lot of the work that you've just done. So to kind of counteract that a little bit, my idea is to paint all the highlights and shadows onto the material first, and then I'll paint the sort of the pattern on top of it. But then of course you have another problem in that the pattern doesn't follow the same lighting as the rest of the material. So that's when you have to glaze on top to try and force the blend in a little bit. Now another option that you could do is to just paint them like darker details in the shadows and lighter details on the highlight parts. Which is something that I could have done as well. The problem is it just gets very, very fiddly, and ultimately the whole concept, I think, was a lot of work, and just for a very kind of mediocre finish. And considering I want to do this as a Golden Demon project, I just didn't think it was really up to par, and like I just didn't like it as I was going along. Like I just kept thinking of other things that I could be doing on there. But so anyway, as I said, like I've started roughly blocking the highlights. You can see that, you know, very rough, like there's paint catching all sorts of areas that it shouldn't. It doesn't matter at this point. If you look at the paints on the wet palette, so I've got 6 colours in there. You can completely discount the bottom 2. So I've got pale grey blue and white at the bottom. I don't use those pretty much. I was considering taking the highlights higher, but then I thought, well, if I take the highlights up to, you know, white, when I start painting on the pattern on top, it's going to be really tricky, even more than it already is. So I just keep the highlights fairly dull and say it's like a darker fabric. But the other colours, so I've got black, and that's primarily for using rubber to fix any mistakes and things. But also, you know, to blend in the shadows a little bit as well. And so, yeah, black in the top right-hand corner. Then I've got German grey, and that's the middle left. Then the top left is neutral grey, and the middle right, that is kind of like a mixture of neutral grey and German grey. And as usual, if you don't have these exact colours, don't worry about it. You can just mix your own. It's just a case of having a range of grey colours, so that you can highlight and shade. You can mix your own versions. Just get some black and white paint. You can have as many steps as you want, really, and the more steps that you have, so the more mixes of paint, then the easier you have it, really, for getting those transitions down. And sometimes I even do extra mixtures, and I don't use them, but they just give me the option just in case. So it does make your life easier, but obviously it's a waste of paint if you do that. But so at this stage, you can see that the paints, the highlights are kind of roughly blocked on. So now we're going to sort of feather it in a little bit. Now I'm going to do this as a stippled look, so it's going to have a little bit of texture. This will separate it out slightly from the red dress, which is sort of like a velvet finish on it. So it's nice to have slightly different texture finishes on varying surfaces, just to help separate the materials out, make the miniature look a bit more interesting. The neutral grey is quite a big jump up from the mix of German grey and neutral grey, so I probably could have done an extra step, but because of how later on when I blend it together I do some glazing on top of it, it does sort of all blend together anyway. I'm using still a scratchy technique at the moment. Just be aware as well, when you first apply the paint, it's going to look a lot lighter. So you can see the neutral grey there. When I touch the model, it looks super bright. Make sure that you can see almost it kind of like dries as you look at it. So when the first mark hits, it looks bright, but then after a second or two, it fades back into the background. It's just something you have to be aware of when you're painting, because you're applying the paints and you think, oh my god, I've gone way too bright there, but actually it's not that far off. And although it is still kind of bright, the sort of feathering marks that I'm making, and later on the stippling as well, will just blend it all together. So don't worry too much about it. It's just sort of kind of getting the light volumes right at this stage as well. So the light volumes just mean sort of like the size of the highlight and the transition going to the shadows. So I don't want this to be a very shiny material, so it's quite a soft, slow transition. Which just means that you can take your time and spread it out. You don't have to worry too much, really. There's not a lot of thinking involved. Just make it as neat and tidy as you can, and it'll look pretty good at the end. You also have to be a little bit careful for some of the marks that you're making. So as the highlights go on, some areas will be brighter than others. So the top area around her hips and the knee that sticks out a bit, that's obviously brighter. It does mean that some of the lower down highlights don't receive as much attention. Now, I already mentioned I'm going to be glazing over it a bit, so that's going to soften everything a little bit. But just be careful, because it can look almost like a different material on the different parts of the cloth, because you'll have spent more time with the highlights on these top sections, which will then look a bit different to the lower sections, because there won't be all these highlight marks on them. So the bottom section could end up looking a bit smoother. But I will kind of when I work on the lower section a bit more as the video goes on, but the glazing will sort it out, hopefully, anyway. But you can see more now, kind of like the size of the marks that I'm making now, they are shrinking down, and they're much more controlled. It's much more stipply. There are still the odd one or two marks. Be more careful when especially when using the neutral grey, because it is so bright that if you do a very radically different mark compared to the other marks that are already there, it will stand out a lot. Try and make sure that the paint's watered down, 1.5 parts water to 1/2 paint, roundabout something like that. When you get to the stippling stage, you could even push it to 2 parts water to 1 part paint. I tend to, so on my little blobs of paint, what I do is I take the paint, put it on the wet palette, from a dropper bottle in this case because it's from the the Vallejo model color range, and then I use like an old paintbrush, dip it in a water pot. It gets a couple of drops of water on. Then I run that down the brush and mix it into the little pool of paint. And what that does is that the center of the paint will be more wet than the outer edge. So the outer edge will be naturally drying faster anyway, and so the inside will be more wet, more fluid. It'll have a higher water content. So if I want something that's very thin, I can dip my brush in the middle of the paint. If I want slightly thicker paint for a harder mark, I can use the outer edge of the paint. And the reason that I want the multiple consistencies is that when I'm doing the stippling, I want like very soft, subtle marks. So using the paint from the center of the the paint dot, it means that because it's more watered down, it'll be much more translucent, and that will make it softer. It means that the paint beneath it will show through a bit more. It just means it all blends together better, so you get a very soft textured look. Whereas if you use thicker paint when you're doing the stippling, it becomes a much harder textured look. So it's kind of like it makes the material look a bit different, kind of like more rough. Whereas the softer element just gives it a very soft, subtle texture. My assumption being that even though she's like a kind of like a dirty undead vampire person, she's probably still, I mean, she's called Lady Annika, so she's some sort of aristocrat, probably likes to wear kind of finer materials rather than something that would be too rough. I know it sounds a bit funny when I say things like that, when talking about the character of the models, but it is something to really consider, especially if you're doing a Golden Demon piece as well, because they do judge how well the way that you've painted it fits into the game world that they've created. So if I just went and painted her, like neon pink all over with weird markings and things, even if I did it really, really well, it's unlikely it would be considered for a Golden Demon because it doesn't fit in with the style and look of the world that Games Workshop have created for Age of Sigmar. Now, obviously, when considering different materials on the model, you're really taking it to almost a ridiculous degree for the how you're considering the painting, but it really is worth thinking about different things. If it's like a model like this one where it's, as I say, an aristocrat, the sort of clothing they wear, would it be kind of like ratty and old and just cheap looking, or will it be fine and expensive looking? Or I mean, it could be fine and expensive looking, but it's still really old and tattered because they've worn the same clothes for hundreds of years or whatever. I don't know. It doesn't. You can make the argument in your head. As long as you stick with it, it should be fine. But just try and make sure that the whole idea fits within, as I said, the Games Workshop world that they've created. And again, this is really focused on like Golden Demon entries and things. If you're just doing this for your own painting, everything I said is irrelevant. You can paint it however you like. You can still paint it to a very high degree. You can paint it for other competitions. They won't care, or at least they shouldn't. But from a Golden Demon perspective, it really is focused on their world. But if you go to something like Monte Sansevino or Crystal Brush when it was on or whatever, all of that is irrelevant. You can paint it as whatever style you choose as long as you do it really well. So, while I've been chattering away there, you can see I've been working more on stippling. You can see how it's kind of like blended together. Now, remember, this is very heavily zoomed in, so you can see the texture marks that I've put on there fairly clearly, I'd say. But considering how small this model is, and just to give you an idea, like if you look at my finger there on the side of the screen, you can see like all the or my fingerprints on there, they're about the same size as the stippling. Oh no, I mean they're even bigger probably. So the idea is, if you hold this model like a foot or a couple of feet away, or a meter or whatever, these marks, they're going to be so soft and subtle that it's going to be quite hard to see them. But being able to see this in the video is good, just to see how the marks are done and things. I mean, you can see me going over and over these marks, and especially on the knee here, you can see how I'm it's almost like I'm refining each dot over and over, and you look exactly where the dot goes. You have to be careful when you're doing stippling because it can get a bit boring, and you kind of shut your brain off and start just doing dots and dots with your brush. The problem is that when you're doing that kind of like refined stippling, you really have to make sure that the dots are going in the right place, and you're not just building up layers of paint, which can create a kind of a thick texture, like a three-dimensional texture on the model, whereas you're kind of missing other tiny little areas and things. The dots should, it's better if you take your time, go a bit slower, and be more precise with where they're going. So at this stage, you can see I could refine it more. I could spend hours really doing super fine dots all over this. However, as I mentioned, I'm going to be painting a pattern over the top. Now the pattern will hide a lot of these details, so I want it to be fairly neat at this stage. So it's neat enough, because what will happen is when you paint the pattern over the top, it will sort of camouflage the rest of it, and also you're bound to make a few mistakes while you're painting the pattern. So you can then, or you will be then using the marks. I mean, not the marks, the paints that you've mixed up for the the different highlight layers, and going back, fixing the patterns using those particular, whatever the highlight color is beneath it. You can then use that to cut in and fix any mistakes you make on the design as you paint it. So here I've got two glaze colors. One is Blue Horror by Games Workshop, and the other is Corvus Black, also by Games Workshop. I kind of just like their colors for glazing with, really. But if you notice, when I started applying the Blue Horror, it was a little bit light. Now it looks, again, it's the same problem with the neutral grey. When you first apply it, it looks super bright. As it dries, it becomes softer. The Corvus Black, you're not going to get that so much, but the Corvus Black is just really beautiful for glazing over edges and things. It's not quite a black colour, it's basically a dark grey, kind of similar to the German grey, but I just like using Games Workshop paints for glazing. They just give a very sort of smooth satin look. I mean, you can then get rid of that satin afterwards with some matte varnish, but I just find that the Games Workshop paints are a little bit more easy to control for glazing at this sort of level or this scale. So I mean, you can see it's looking fairly neat again, as I said. In hindsight, I probably didn't need to even spend this much time on it, really. At this stage, it's not good enough as a Golden Demon entry, for the finish on that. Like, if I was just leaving this black, I'd have to spend a lot longer, put probably some little bounce highlights on it even. But also, the intention was, it still is, but it'll be for the next design that I paint on it, is to have the bottom very faded and tattered with all dirt and mud spatters going up at the bottom. I'm still going to do that. That's going to be a different video. It should be quite interesting as well. But so it's just worth bearing in mind. So you've seen the process to get to this stage, but you just have to do a lot more of it to make that look super duper neat. And I say a lot more. It's not really a lot more. It'd take a little while, especially this bottom section just needs a bit more. But again, remembering that I've already planned in my head that I'm going to be painting over a lot of this with dirt anyway, so it's not worth as much, spending that much time on it. And you can see here as well, as I said, so even though these are now glazes, around about probably 7 or 8 parts water to 1 part paint. You can take it even further as well if you want. But even in that case, I can still do stippling with these colours, particularly the blue horror. And it just creates such soft, subtle marks with it. Now, if you just do the whole model with that kind of stippling, which you could, it's going to take you a long time to do, but you would end up with something that looks so neat and kind of interesting looking. But I would urge you not to do every surface with the same type of stippling, because that actually starts looking boring again, because then every surface has the same finish. If you try and make different surfaces have different finishes, it's just so much more interesting to look at. But the problem with this kind of painting as well is sometimes you can't actually see the difference you're making, and again, you can get a bit bored doing it. But the problem is, so you keep on doing these marks, you're like, oh, when's it going to show what I've done? You turn off, you just carry on doing it, then you look at it and you think, oh no, I've done too much now. Suddenly it's very clear what you've done, and you just laid over the same bit too many times. So now I'm going to be painting on the pattern. I do make a mistake straight away when painting on this pattern, but so the problem is, I do have a pattern in mind. I researched it a bit, but the problem is the scale. Now, for one, this model is already quite small in comparison to many other models. Don't worry about how the brush sort of looks like it separates there. I was just using the very tip, so of course certain hairs are going to make contact with the model and others aren't, and when you push like that, the bristles that aren't touching the model, they can flick out, but they're not touching anything, so it doesn't matter. As long as you're just sticking with the very tip of the brush, it shouldn't make an issue. But the marks that I'm making using the very tip of the brush. Now, really, you want to be always dragging the mark towards yourself. Whereas if you sort of push it, or even kind of like do it sideways a little bit, you're going to find that it separates more like that. You don't get a clean line. You have all sorts of issues. So always kind of like pull the bristles towards you if you can. So it's a little bit more tricky for me because I'm trying to film it. So I'm trying to keep the model in a position where you can see what's going on. Ideally, I would, generally what I tend to do is do a little bit, then turn the camera off and carry on doing it so I can really focus on what I'm doing. But make sure that you're in a comfortable position, and as I said, try and draw, do these long, slow, straight lines, like curved lines, but smooth. Try and do them in one motion, and try and do it so that you're always pulling the brush towards yourself. So anyway, I was going to talk about the mistake that I made, and due to the scale. And so we've already covered it's a small model. The pattern that I looked at was quite dense, and I'm like, it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time to do something, even though it's on a small area, because of the amount of detail on it, it's going to be a fair amount of effort to do. But I didn't plan it out properly. So I'd done the research for the pattern, but I didn't plan how it was going to look on the model. I just I'll just get straight in there and start painting it. Now these first marks that you're seeing, I'm just sort of randomly placing them on, and then I'm going to adapt and fix them as we go. But they're way too big. These are huge, these lines. And that was the main thing that I didn't like about the look at the end. Now, of course, don't worry about how good or bad the lines look at this stage. I'm just very roughly placing them on. They'll all be fixed towards the end. And you'll see that's a different step. This is just kind of like mapping out where they're going. But for something for a Golden Demon entry, and also just for my own preference, in fact my own preference is more important than how relevant it is as a competition piece. I just didn't like it, and regardless of what anyone else would think about it, I'm sure a few people will like it, but it doesn't mean anything to me. For the most important thing when I'm painting something is that I'm enjoying it and I like how it looks. even sometimes to the extent that it could cost you competitions, trophies and things, because you've painted something that people don't necessarily like, but at the end of the day you've got to paint it. So trophies don't mean anything if you're not painting something that you enjoy or that you like. And in this case, I just really didn't like it. Didn't do anything for me. I just wasted a few days of my life doing this. But and part of that is as well because I'm having to record it. Like, it takes time recording all these things and whatever. It doesn't really matter. But if you're gonna do something like this, you really have to take the time to plan out how you're going to paint it. I'm kind of winging this. So the pattern, I'm not following a pattern. I've researched a pattern for the shapes that each of these marks are going to be. So you can't really tell at the minute. They're just random kind of swirls, whatever shapes I'm painting on. And then after that, then I start adding all the details. So there's like little leaves and shapes and things that will all be adapted and placed onto the swirls. And it really does make a big difference for how neat it looks. But I need to have painted these much, much smaller and just really considered the composition of them. Possibly having them larger at the edges and then all aiming towards the centre where they'll get smaller and finer. Or anything like that, really, because what I found as well was that it wasn't very evenly balanced, and this is a problem when painting kind of random patterns. Now, if you're doing a very precise pattern, that also has issues as well. One is it can be very boring because you're having to do lots of repetitious painting over and over to make everything look the same, and when you make mistakes, it stands out more because when it all has to look the same, it's very easy to spot things that aren't. I didn't have those issues with this because I could paint it however I wanted. But the problem is when you can just paint things how you want and you're a little bit, lazy with how you've decided to plan it out, you just, you make mistakes or you're not thinking about what you're doing. And the other problem with this is, so because I'm doing swirls everywhere, it has some very hard edges on the folds on this, and it's really hard to paint swirls, curved smooth lines going over hard edge folds, because you have to do different layers of pressure as you're going around the folds, and when it's such a hard line, there's a couple of very hard lines on this, or very deep folds, then you can't make the brush follow those smoothly. So here you can see I'd finished off covering the whole area, and I think you can see more clearly now what I was talking about with how they're just too big. They're way too big. Now if you look down at this section here that I'm starting to do now, and you can see I've done a little bit of it already where I've cleaned it up, thickened a lot of the lines, added in more detail, and that added detail, it does help a lot. It it kind of bounces it more, but the problem is that there's still all these really big curls everywhere, the big long swirly bits, and they just look too big and they didn't look elegant to me. If I was doing it again, and I've already said that they needed to be smaller, and really it's just the big swirls that needed to be smaller, more broken up. I just like more detail, lots more detail. If you imagine this kind of pattern, like say she's say 6 feet tall, she's got big heels on. If she's 6 feet tall and you imagine this piece of fabric, in reality the size of these details are huge. So you can see that sort of small section there, it's like as big as her foot. It just looks kind of clumsy for the scale, I think. So yeah, if I was going to do this pattern again, it has to be much smaller, and I think So I talked at the beginning of the video about painting the highlights on beforehand. I don't think I'd do that. The detail needed to make these much smaller, it becomes very hard to paint these sort of details because you just can't get the smooth kind of movements on the brush especially in some of the recesses. It becomes more like kind of stabbing at the model. So I just leave it all black, paint on the details as finely and detailed as I could, and then glaze on top of it with the highlights and shadows. I don't think the highlights and shadows will look as good as they do by painting them on beforehand, but I think that the pattern becomes more. The pattern is more important, I feel, in this case than the highlights and shadows, and because of the way that I've done it, I don't feel that the pattern was good enough. But you can see here, so what I was talking about, going back in with the different greys you've mixed, and it would be worth also mixing some extra ones in as well, because you obviously have got quite a bit of variation in some of the highlights and shadows from the base color work, and you need the base color work to match the area around the pattern that you're painting. So if you make a mistake or you want to neaten it up a little bit, the background is the correct color, so because you're painting over it again. For the paint consistency for this, now you have to be a little bit careful. You don't want the paint too thin, especially with these very fine marks, because it just isn't going to leave a clean mark. It will so you should have noticed how the paint reacts when you were doing the stippling for the very thin marks, and what it does is it sort of bleeds out a little bit, which helps to give you that sort of soft look to each dot. And the same thing will happen with the freehand details here. If the paint is too thin, it will sort of bleed a little bit and it'll give you a much softer mark, whereas you want hard marks for this. So the paint needs to be around about 50-50 water to paint, but it's something that you'd have to experiment with yourself because each paint is different. And this also leads me to another negative about this freehand, in that I used a grey colour. So for the actual grey that I'm using, it's dark sea grey. It doesn't matter specifically. I did pick that one out because it means that it's got a slightly warmer colour compared to the other grey, like the neutral grey that was already mixed in there. So it does separate out the pattern a little bit. But because you're using grey, so you're using a very light colour on top of a black, the light colour obviously has white pigment in it, and white pigment is always tricky to work with because it's like the largest pigment. So it's more likely that you'll get sort of blobs of paint that don't flow quite smoothly. It just it makes your life harder. You'd have an easier time of it if you paint black details on top of a lighter colour. Black has like the smallest particles, so you get a much smoother finish. It's way easier to paint freehand with black lines than it is with white lines. So I seem to be complaining a lot about this. I think the main thing is because it took ages to do, even though it's sort of fairly mediocre for the result, mediocre in everything's relative. So in terms of a Golden Demon entry, painting these sort of details, it takes ages, and so I was a little bit annoyed with myself that I hadn't taken the time to do it properly. So a lot of times when I freehand, especially if I'm doing skulls and things, they're quite easy for me because I've painted them a lot. I know how they go, so I don't have to think too hard about it. I don't do quite as much pattern work, and so really I needed to spend more time, needed to practice a little bit before putting the paint to the model. So having like a bit of trash plastic or whatever, and practicing doing the pattern work on it beforehand so that I can train myself with muscle memory for getting the very fine marks I needed, for the flowing lines and things, because I could make these marks much smaller and finer, And I think it probably would have looked all right if, I'd done everything half the size and like really packed in the detail. But like, this is like it looks kind of. It does look interesting by the time I finish it. Anyway, at the moment it still looks a little bit rough with the, the very kind of raw work in the background there. But from a distance, from a arm's length away, it looks fine. Like it would be actually really nice as a tabletop piece, for a very high end tabletop piece, but for your army general or something, having these patterns on would look great because they're very visible. It's high contrast, and they stand out a lot on the table. But in terms of this, the finer details, like everything has to be almost flawless, really, for a Golden Demon piece, because all the people that are going to win will do flawless entries. So the standard is already set. There's no it doesn't matter if your model is even really interesting with the concepts and things. The finish has to be of a very, very high standard. But talking about finish as well, so just going back to the all the other greys on the palette there, it is really handy. Like, so a lot of people will probably find that trying to paint patterns like this, or any sort of pattern really, when you paint it on, it's really hard to get smooth, clean lines. Remember, again, this is zoomed in, so if you looked at this at normal scale, the lines, the more finished lines, but even the rough lines, they do look quite clean. But when you use the background color to cut into it, you get a much, much sharper finish. So it is nice in that it kind of frees you to focus more on the design that you're doing, not worry too much if you make a mistake, because then you've got your rubber, you've got your background paints to go over it, and you can make it much sharper and cleaner than you probably ever could from just painting it straight, neat first off. So here you can see I just cut straight into it. You want the paint a little bit thinner really for cutting in, and also because it's a darker colour, it's just a little bit easier to work with. But you can see there how I shrunk it down and refined that shape a little bit. I'll probably mess around with it a little bit too much, and that is a danger with these sort of things. You can end up wasting time. It's kind of better to focus on getting the whole area done, and then going back to refining it, because you can end up sort of refining pieces that don't need refining, just because you fiddle around a lot with these sort of details. And it can be a case of you spend half an hour or something doing a detail there, and then you're like, actually, I can't tell the difference between how it looked before. So, just be careful with those kind of things. One of the important parts about these shapes is the flow of the shape. So you have to constantly keep in mind the kind of S shape. Really nice, there's S shapes all over this. And then you want like all the fatter sort of shapes, they flow with the lines into the thinner shapes and spikes and leaves and things. Everything needs to flow into the shape. You don't want any lines that are hard, cutting across, making very hard marks. Everything needs to be sort of soft and smooth. The other thing to aim for when doing these marks is to try and make the details quite opaque. So very solid details. You don't want to have much in the way of translucent lines. It'll look unfinished. You can see the difference if you look in the lower section on the skirt, how strong the and opaque the line work is there, and then you compare it to the rough work that's not been worked on yet. The difference in the opacity there. So the other pieces, obviously, you can see the black paint showing through underneath. So you can see there, just from that little small section, how long it takes to do some of these marks. And it's just because they're so small, they take a lot of work. You're going backwards and forwards, doing a mark here, a mark there. Oh, that mark's a little bit too big. Now I've got to go back and cut into it again. Every time you have to go back to the wet palette, it's kind of such a pain, because it is sort of doubling the amount of time you take. If you can stay just using one, whatever amount of paint is on the brush, and carry on going, you'll be a lot faster. Whereas if after every mark you have to put your brush back in the paint, it's going to take you twice as long to do the same work. But that does depend a lot on the humidity, the consistency of the paint, all sorts of things like that. But you can learn to sort of paint faster, rather than you can spend a lot of time and not get any work done, basically. So try not to fall into that trap of just fiddling with every single piece. Just focus on getting it done, because otherwise you end up like me, where I've painted this thing and you just don't like it, and it took a long time. So you can see every line that I've painted on kind of ends in either like a bobble or a leaf or like a fatter mark, which kind of like puts, so that also kind of adds to the problem almost, because you can see there's lots of these big details, because each little bobble or leaf or whatever that finishes the line kind of gives an indication of how big each part of the pattern is. So it just looks like lots of big pieces of pattern, whereas I wanted it to be small, fine details all over. Now I could have connected it all together. There's probably a lot of things I could have done to it, actually. I just carried on working, adding more and more details, connecting them all together. That probably would have worked as well, actually. Thinking about it now, maybe I could have saved it, but it's besides the point. I have other ideas now for what I'm going to do to it. And I'm going to record that for video as well, so you'll be able to see the difference. You can even tell me which you prefer, and then if you prefer this one and I've wasted my time and ruined what I've already done, that's great, I suppose. But we all learn from our mistakes, and because I don't paint patterns very much, it's just something that I need to work on a little bit more, or think about what I'm actually doing rather than just trying to go for it. The other annoying thing is, and this will be true for a lot of pattern painting, the design of the pattern will change as you make progress. You'll kind of you'll get better as you go. You'll kind of sort of go into a certain style more. There'll be a particular design that you'll repeat more often, and so that's another reason why it's good to spend a little bit of time before you start on the model practicing, because then you'll have got through that stage a little bit, so everything will look much more similar. But anyway, so here's like the pattern where it's painted all over, and now I'm kind of glazing over the top of it, so you can see the highlights underneath, but it's more the shaded parts that need the work. So back with the Corvus black, watered down around about 7 or 8 parts water to 1 part paint. Really take your time with this if you want to save the pattern, and you're just painting over the areas in the shadows. You need to darken them down, which will then kind of give the impression that some areas are in shadow, including the pattern, rather than having the pattern be the same brightness all over. This will actually take a little bit of time, especially because there's quite a bit of variation in some of the highlights and shadows. I've also got, again, the blue horror colour for glazing over the top. This will soften the brightest parts of the highlights, or rather the brightest parts of the pattern on top, because it's quite a bit stronger than the bright highlights, and it should almost blend together into the highlights. And again, for glazes, load the brush up, then run it on some kitchen roll or something absorbent, so there's not much left on the brush. You just get a very fine thin layer of paint that goes over, and it should dry very quickly when you apply it, so you're not having to wait any time. You have to make sure that you drain the brush off on the kitchen roll or whatever, because if you just load the brush up by dipping it in the well and then applying it to the model, it's going to flood the area. It'll work like a wash and go into the recesses. You don't want to flood the area. You want complete control over the application. So it'll look like as you're going along that you're not making any difference, but just keep at it, and after a little bit of time, you'll see the difference. So in the shadows it'll become much softer and things. But anyway, so that's the end of the video. Apologies, it didn't turn out the way I wanted, but you've got to see what I did anyway. And in the next couple of days I'm going to be putting out another video with my new design on top of it. But anyway, so that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.